Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Colossians. We're in Colossians chapter 4. Today we're looking at verse 14. Now we spent the last few sessions examining Paul's concluding words to the Colossian believers. And in his final greetings to them, he gives greetings from a number of people who are with him. And we've been looking at some of the names he mentions, his associates in ministry, who are also sending their greetings to the Colossian church. And he mentions a couple of more in verse 14. Now our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send their greetings. But he mentions two people. First he mentions Luke. Now we're quite familiar with Luke. And notice he calls him the doctor. We know that Luke was a physician. He was a doctor. And we know he joined Paul's missionary band or company on Paul's second missionary journey. When you read the book of Acts, in the middle of Paul's second missionary journey, Luke suddenly joins them. And for the rest of Paul's ministry, Luke is associated with Paul. Paul mentions him in a number of the letters, like here in Colossians. And also, of course, when you read in Acts, if you'll notice what are called the we passages, from the second missionary journey on, sometimes the word reads, we did this and we did that. That we refers to Luke. For you see, Luke wrote the book of the Acts of the Apostles. So when you come across one of those we passages, Luke is with Paul. When he talks about Paul did this and Paul did that, then we know that Luke is not with them. So sometimes Luke is with them, and sometimes he's left behind to oversee churches Paul has founded. It's very interesting to see that Luke becomes closely associated with the ministry of Paul. We know that Luke was with Paul when he traveled to Jerusalem, that last visit in which he was arrested and then spent a couple of years in imprisonment in Rome. We also know that Luke accompanied Paul to Rome when he was sent there to stand trial before Caesar. And he is still obviously with Paul in Rome when this book of Colossians is written. One more thing about Luke, he wrote the gospel that bears his name. Luke wrote the gospel, obviously, of Luke. Now it's interesting, Luke was not an apostle. You know, Matthew was an apostle. John was an apostle. Mark was not, but he was closely associated with the apostle Peter. Luke was associated with Paul. You wonder sometimes, where did Luke get all the information that he used in writing the Gospel of Luke? Well, a lot he drew from Paul because he was associated with Paul for a number of years. But also, you remember I told you that Paul spent 2 years in Roman imprisonment in Caesarea after being arrested in Jerusalem before he was sent to Rome. Luke was with him in those 2 years. I suspect that during those 2 years, Luke was gathering information from the believers in the Judean area, talking to them and learning the stories of Jesus, which he then later used to write the Gospel of Luke. We don't know that for sure, but I feel pretty certain that Luke gathered information through personal interviews with first-generation believers during that time of Paul's imprisonment in Caesarea, to gather the information that he would later tell us in the Gospel of Luke. But anyway, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote the book of the Acts of the Apostles. So Luke is very, very important to our understanding of the Gospel through his Gospel and the history of the early church in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. And it all came about because of his close association with the Apostle Paul. Probably Paul wanted Luke with him because he was a doctor. He could help them with their physical needs as well as the spiritual ministry he provided by being one of the companions. So Luke is very important in New Testament history. And it's interesting to see how closely he was associated with the Apostle Paul. Now he also mentions Demas in this verse. We find Demas mentioned in a couple of places. He's mentioned here in Colossians. He's also mentioned in the book of Philemon, where I told you those letters were written at the same time. And so his name just pops up as one who is sending greetings. So he also is an associate of Paul. However, he has a sad story, and we're going to look at that tomorrow. There's a sad ending to the role of Demas, but we'll look at that in tomorrow's session. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Colossians.